Let's go back into our Native American unit here in our history books. And we're continuing to talk about the Chippewa. We'll be taking a quiz on this probably at the end of this session. So let's talk about the Chippewas. They lived in the Northeast, kind of up by the Canada area, around New York, kind of up about there, Maine. Can you kind of picture that in your head? New Hampshire and in that area, Vermont. Okay, that's where they lived. They lived basically in the forest. They were a large tribe. They were called the Chippewa. They were also called the Ojibwa. And they lived in a land that was not so much forests, like we have forests with our evergreen trees, but they lived in a land that was full of maple trees and oak trees and those kinds of trees that turn very beautiful. And even today, if you go to that area in the fall time, it is known to be a very colorful, beautiful area because of all the different kinds of deciduous trees that they have. On page 33, you can see a picture of where the little canoe is, and it says that the Chippewas' home was actually the forest. They were happy in the forest. They lived in the forest. They did never stay in one place very long, so they didn't grow gardens, and they just always were traveling. They were a traveling people, and they could travel through the forest incredibly quickly and incredibly quietly, and they, if necessary, they built a little house called a wigwam that was made out of branches. They kind of would lean it together kind of idea, but they didn't really live in a wigwam very much. Maybe in the worst of weather, because it can be very cold in that area. It can be, winter cold, like with snow, but they might have used a wigwam then, but the wigwams were not structures. They were not well made. They were just kind of lean-tos, kind of to make do for getting out of the rain or getting out of the bad snowstorm. So there's a picture there on page 33. That's a very organized wigwam. That wigwams didn't look quite that nice, but this one does. But most of the wigwams were very rough. They were people that lived close to a lot of water, a lot of creeks, a lot of rivers, a lot of small lakes. And the Indians were constantly moving, and the easiest place to move through any kind of forest or any kind of woods is by using the waterways. And so they would use the water, the rivers, the creeks, and so forth, if they could get a boat to go down the river or even up the river. It was a faster way to get from place to place. And so one of the things that these people are known for are the birch bark canoes. And once they got a log felled, or sometimes they would use a log that was already down, had already naturally fallen. And remember, they did not have steel. They didn't have any metal. So the things they had to work with were rock and bone. They did have those two items, but they didn't have much when it came to hatchets or when it came to small axes or when it came to knives that were metal. They had none of that. And so these were the Indians that were constantly moving from place to place, and when they found their favorite birch bark piece of wood, their log, they had to find a way to make it into a canoe. So their best method was to start a fire on one side of it. They would take the bark off. The birch bark isn't quite as thick as a regular bark of a tree, but they would take the bark off if they could, and then they would build a fire and let the fire burn on top of the tree for a while, and then they would put the fire out, and they would spend days scraping out all the charred wood until it kind of got a little divot, and they just kept day after day building a fire, divoting, scraping out the divots, and until they had finally a canoe. And a canoe could last a family an entire life. They went from place to place with this canoe. It wasn't a canoe that, it was so hard to build. You didn't need to build several of them. It was just like you're a one canoe family kind of idea, or two canoe family. And they moved the canoes from place to place, from lake to lake, and so the canoes were an important method of transportation to the Chippewa tribe, whereas the Cherokee never thought about it. The Cherokee did not make canoes. They didn't have as much water. The water was not, I can't say it wasn't their friend, there just wasn't that much of it. And so they never really thought to use a canoe to get from place to place. So for the Cherokee, a canoe was an unheard of thing. For the Chippewas, the canoe was, it was a very important part of their lives. All right. Then we learned that these Indians, they ate from the forest. And of course, they had all the wild meat that they wanted, including fish. But they also ate some interesting things in the forest. And there were three things that they gathered. And I ask you to remember those three things. One was that they gathered maple syrup. And maple syrup, well, they didn't really gather it. They gathered maple sap from a maple tree. And in the early part of the spring, like in February, when the sap from that's located below the level of the earth, when it started to rise into the branches, into the tree trunks, they would tap it. That means make a hole in the bark of the canoe. Sorry, not the canoe. What am I talking about? Oh, dear me. In the bark of the tree. There we go. They would make a hole, and the sap would leak out, and they would catch it in a container, and then they would boil that sap. And it took a lot of sap to make just a little bit of maple syrup. But they would use that. They would continue to boil it, and it would finally crystallize and make a maple sugar. And to the Indian kiddos, that was like every bit as good as our candy. To them it was like unbelievably delicious and wonderful. Sometimes they would drip it on snow and then they would make kind of a caramel, and they would eat it that way. But to them, capturing or getting this maple sugar was wonderful, and they could keep it. It would keep for until the next year. So they tried to make as much as they could, or gather as much as they could, and make this maple sugar, which was a delicacy. Another thing they had was wild rice. And on page 34, you can see the picture of the lady in the canoe. And this wild rice was like weeds or reeds that grew alongside the waters of the lakes, not usually along moving water, but along still water. And it blossomed, and it formed this grain. It's black. Looks like a bunch of fat pieces of lead from a pencil, kind of like that. And it doesn't have much of a flavor, but it's very nutritious. It's very healthy. And they would pick it, and they would take that little clip. You can see she has a clip in her hand, and she would knock on it, and it would knock the rice off the sticks and off the stalks, and it would be in the bottom of the canoe. And then they would take that, and they could eat this wild rice for years. It would stay for absolutely years and years and years. And it was a wonderful, nutritious delicacy that these Chippewas had. And the other thing I asked you to remember was the blueberries. And even today, Maine blueberries are very well known. Now, they're not big, fat, tame blueberries like the ones we have here. Our blueberry, those blueberries you see at the stores, are blueberries that are grown on tame plants. But these are wild blueberries. They've got a lot more flavor, and they are small. They're like the eraser on your pencil, about that big. And they grow in Maine, in that area. They grew then, and they're still growing now. Kind of like our huckleberries, kind of along that line, even maybe a little smaller than our huckleberry, but they have a great flavor. And so they would take those, and they would pick them. They would get into a patch, and they would pick them for, weeks and weeks and weeks. And then they would dry them in the sun, lay them on their skins, and roll them over until they were nice and dried. And then they also could keep those for years. They were well preserved because they had no moisture in them, so they didn't mold or rot, but they could keep those. So those were three wonderful things that they had that most Indian tribes didn't get. On page 35, you can see a picture of how they made their clothes, because they also made their clothes from deer skin. And of course, you can see the deer in the red square at the top. And I'm looking at this page right here, so in case you don't know, right there. So they have the red deer at the top, and they've killed the deer. The Indians have killed the deer, and then they've taken their skinning knife. Now, they may look like a piece of metal, but it's not metal. It's only a bone, and it's attached with some kind of probably some kind of insides, like tendons or whatever of a deer, to a handle, and they're using that to skin out the deer, to take the skin off the meat, okay? Remember, they're slitting the deer. They're going to cut the deer. They're going to kill the deer, and they usually killed it with a bow and arrow. That was what they had. They didn't have blowguns like the Cherokee, and probably a blowgun wouldn't have really killed a deer. A blowgun was for a smaller animal. So they had to probably use a bow and arrow, okay? So they used the bow and they used the arrow went through, and then the deer died. And then they slit the deer from right here, right down, clear down, and they would open him up. They take all his insides out. Then they would start to take away the skin from the deer. So it would take the skin away from the flesh, because the flesh they were going to eat, and the skin they were going to keep. So that's what it's showing there. They're using the knife to separate the skin from the flesh. In the golden square there, you can see they soaked it, because a deer is not as it looks. Lots of times a deer is full of things like ticks, bugs of some kind that get in the deer hide and live. And so they soaked it and drowned those bugs, and they got the deer dirt out of it, so to speak. And then you can see a rock there at the bottom, and that was their scraping rock. And they would scrape the hide, which that's what they called the skin. They would scrape the hide inside and outside. They would scrape any kind of bloody tissue that would be left, or any kind of meat that would be left, or they scraped the fur part, the part that's fuzzy. They would scrape that off till they just got to the hide. And a deer hide is quite thick, and so they could make their clothes out of it, and they didn't really need the fur anyway. I mean, maybe sometimes they used it, but they didn't really need the fur, so they scraped it away. You can see in the dark green picture, they're soaking it again after the scraping, and then they're taking this hide and they're stretching it. They're stretching it out, as you can see in kind of that grayish picture there. They're stretching it and they're holding it tight. They're putting holes in it and they're holding it tight, because as it wants to shrink as it gets dry, just like, sometimes you put clothes in the dryer, and they were one size when you put them in, and by the time you get them back, they're smaller, and you can't wear that anymore because it's too tight. It's too small. Maybe you've had that problem in your house. I have. So they stretch it out, and they keep it stretched as tight as they can. And you think, well, now we're ready to make the clothes. But no, then they have to scrape it again, because without the scraping, it's the scraping that makes it soft. Just like if you were to take a piece of paper, just a plain old piece of paper, I have this one here. If you were to take that paper and you were to take a rock and you just scrape it back and forth across this 300 times, okay? Not pushing hard, but just 300 times the rock with this sharp rock. The paper would feel different. It would feel fuzzy, because you had taken some of the finish off of it. Well, the same kind of idea with after they stretch their hide, now they're scraping it and they're making it soft. Some women would chew it, and they would chew and chew and chew, and then they would go to a next section and chew. But the most common way of doing it was to scrape. And they would scrape back and forth and spend days. The women would spend days in trying to get a piece that is soft enough, piece that is bendable enough that you want to wear it, because they're making clothes out of it. And then the last picture there at the top one, where it says, it's kind of purple and it says tanning. Then they had to find a way to preserve this skin. It wasn't like it automatically preserved itself. So they found a way that if they put it in over smoke and fire, that it would actually preserve it, like smoked meat, like smoked bacon, like jerky. Okay, how is jerky? How do you keep jerky? I mean, jerky, if it's made out of beef, which most of the time it is, if it's made out of beef, you can't take a piece of beef out of your refrigerator and put it in your pocket, even if it was wonderful beef, even if it was beef that Mommy had cooked on the barbecue. You can't just take a piece of meat and sit it in your pocket and come back 3 weeks later and think it's going to be okay to eat. No, you eat it. For one thing, it's going to be moldy and it's going to be gross looking and gross smelling. But if you did eat it, you'd be sicker than sick. No, you can't just eat stuff like that. So they do a process called making jerky. Similar thing to this tanning. They take a piece of meat and they smoke it in a smoker. And then they take that same strip, but they take all of the juice out of it, all that makes it susceptible to bacteria. They take all of that out because it's dehydrated, so to speak. And then, after it's smoked for a period of time, then you can keep jerky. You can keep it for probably several years in certain cases. So the same thing with their tanning. They can't just kill the animal and take the skin off the animal and put it on you. It doesn't work that way. It would rot. And so they smoked it and they tanned it. And then it was useful. Then they could make moccasins. Then they could make their clothes, their skirts, their leggings, their jackets, whatever. They could use it then. The deer was useful, but not until that whole process. So going from square red all the way down to square purple, you can see was quite the process. So it was an everyday chore. And it was the women's chore. It wasn't the men's chore. It was the men's chore to shoot the deer in the first place. But it was women's chore to make the clothes. And in order to make the clothes, she had to do all the steps in order to get the piece of fabric. Today, if Mommy's going to make you something, she goes down to Joann's and she buys a piece of fabric. That's it. And she cuts it out from there and makes it on the sewing machine from there. But not in this day. This day, you had to make the fabric first. And they got it from deer. So these were a tribe that wore deer skins. They ate deer. Deer was like their friend. They also could have made, you can make hide and things from elk and maybe from moose, but it's not, I don't know why, but it's not quite as common as just a plain old deer hide. So the things you need to know for the quiz, you're going to take in about 5 minutes. You ready? Okay, this is what you need to know. The Chippewa Indians lived in the Northeast, kind of by Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, up kind of by Canada. Okay? They lived in the forest. That was their favorite place to live. But if they had to make do, they made a house called a wigwam. It was made out of branches, and it wasn't very fine. It wasn't like fine carpentry. It was just kind of lean-tos, but it got them out of the snow. These are the people that made birch bark canoes, and they used the canoes because there was lots and lots of water in that area. They got to gather 3 special things. Now, most Indians got to gather lots of things, and these Indians did too. But 3 special things that we're going to talk about. Remember, one was the maple syrup, and they got that from the tree, and they boiled it. They got the sap from the tree. It's kind of like watery, and it's sweet, but it's watery, and it doesn't taste like much. But after you boil the water out, it gets to be a nice, thick syrup kind of idea, okay? And if they kept it, if they kept boiling it, it turns out to look like brown sugar, okay? And if you don't know what brown sugar is, go ask Mommy, because she's got some for you. And maybe she'll let you taste a little bit of brown sugar, okay? So that was like a really great delicacy that they loved. Another was that they gathered wild rice, just like the picture on page 34. The lady gathered wild rice, and they could keep this rice was a grain, and it was able to be kept for years and years and years, and it was a healthy, it was a good source of nutrition for these Indians. Okay, so wild rice, and the third was the blueberries. And these were not like today's blueberries where they're tame, but these were the little wild blueberries, like the size of your eraser on your pencil, or if you've ever been huckleberry picking, kind of like that. And they would pick the blueberries and dry them, dehydrate them. Today, maybe Mommy doesn't have a dehydrator, but they didn't have that, so they just put them on their blankets, and their blankets were made out of skins. And then they would roll them over, and pretty soon all the juice would be out of them, and they could keep their blueberries and use blueberries throughout the year until the blueberry season happened again. Okay, on page 35, you need to know that these were the Indians that wore deer skin. Okay, I think if you know all that information, you're going to do awesome on the test. I hope so. Okay, talk to you again tomorrow. Bye-bye.